Welcome to the fleet that was never supposed to survive. Two 710 Liberty ships built faster than any fleet in history, most meant to last only a single voyage, yet they carried the war on their rusted shoulders. January 1943. North Atlantic. A gray sea, endless and cold. Fog curling around the decks, the echo of diesel engines trembling beneath waves. U-boats circle like wolves' periscopes, cutting through foam, waiting for another helpless merchantman to die in silence. But tonight something is different. The convoy doesn't break. The enemy's torpedoes strike steel after steel, and still the line holds. In the dark, one silhouette rises behind another dozens. Hundreds blacked-out hulls vanishing into mist. The Germans call it the steel wall. The Allies call it survival. These weren't warships. They were floating miracles, each welded together by hands that had never seen the sea women with sparks in their hair, men too old for the front children watching from factory gates. Every bolt was a heartbeat. Every launch a prayer. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And what would you have done standing there in the freezing wind, watching a ship built in 40 days sail into a war it might never return from? December 1941, the month when the ocean turned from blue to black. The Atlantic, vast, ancient, indifferent, became a graveyard of steel. Merchant ships that once carried grain and coal now burned on the horizon, their masts collapsing into smoke. Oil slicks glistened in the moonlight. Wreckage drifted among bodies. The sea that once connected continents had become the front line of a silent war. No uniforms, no trenches. Only echoes, gunfire swallowed by fog. SOS signals fading into static. From Newfoundland to Gibraltar, the German U-boats ruled the deep. Sleek, predatory mechanical beasts gliding through darkness. Each periscope rise was a death sentence. A single torpedo could erase a crew, a cargo, a hope. They called it the happy time, those months when the hunters feasted on helpless convoys. Whole fleets disappeared without trace. The waves closed over them as if the ocean had simply decided who would live and who would not. The water carried whispers, the names of ships that never reached port. The United States, stunned by Pearl Harbor, was only beginning to awaken. Its factories still echoed with peacetime rhythms, automobiles, refrigerators, the hum of domestic life. But across the Atlantic, Britain was starving. Churchill's cables to Washington grew desperate. The Battle of the Atlantic is the dominating factor throughout the war. Never let us forget this. It was not rhetoric, it was a confession. Without ships, the empire would wither. Without cargo, no army could march. Every bullet fired in Tunisia, every ration in Moscow, every drop of aviation fuel in London, all began in an American port. And those ports were emptying faster than they could fill. By early 1942, the numbers defied belief. For Allied ships sunk in 1 month alone. 3 million tons of supplies lost beneath black water. Entire convoys erased before dawn. Men burned alive on oil-covered seas, while seagulls circled above them like silent mourners. The Atlantic had become the most dangerous battlefield on Earth, yet there were no medals for the men who crossed it. Inside a government office in Washington, Henry J. Kaiser leaned over a map dotted with red pins, each one a grave. He wasn't a sailor. He wasn't a naval officer. He was a builder of dams, of bridges, of dreams made from concrete. But he saw what the admirals didn't, that the war could only be won through mass production, not perfect design. The Navy wanted craftsmanship. Kaiser demanded speed. Ships, he said quietly, must become as replaceable as bullets. He tore through bureaucracy like a storm. Empty stretches of coastline became shipyards in months. Richmond, Portland, Baltimore, Savannah, places that had never smelled salt water, were now pulsing with engines and steel. The night skies glowed orange from molten metal, a new kind of dawn born from desperation. The clang of hammers never stopped. Floodlights burned through fog. America was building not just ships, but a heartbeat. Women arrived first, thousands of them, wearing overalls, scarves, tied tight against their hair. Housewives, secretaries, waitresses. They learned to weld, to rivet, to measure steel plate by instinct and sound. They worked in shifts that never ended 12, 14, 16 hours while their children slept under sirens. The men who remained too old or too young for war joined them. The shipyards became living cities of exhaustion and pride. Somewhere between the sparks and the smoke, a new America was being born. The Liberty ship was their child, awkward, boxy, ungraceful. Sailors laughed at first. She's so slow, they said, that the seagulls will nest on her deck before she reaches England. But under her crude exterior was genius. Prefabrication, 250,000 parts built in different states assembled like a puzzle. Steel from Pittsburgh, boilers from Chicago, engines from Ohio. Every piece shipped by rail and joined in yards that had never existed 6 months earlier. It was chaos, organized chaos, but it worked. The first of them, the SS Patrick Henry, slid into the water in September 1941. Roosevelt's words echoed across the ceremony. "We shall deliver the goods." Those words became prophecy. By 1942, shipyards across America thundered with rhythm, the rhythm of speed. Kaiser's engineers cut days into hours, hours into minutes. The old shipwrights scoffed welding was crude, they said. Rivets were tradition. "They'll split in the ice," warned the experts. But the ice never had a say. The war couldn't wait for perfection, and then came the record. 4 days, 15 hours, 26 minutes. A ship from keel to ocean. The workers didn't believe it themselves. They wept as champagne broke against her hull, not for celebration, but for relief. Every hammer blow had meant one less sailor drowning somewhere across the world. The factories became cathedrals of labor, and each Liberty ship a floating prayer. Still, the ocean was merciless. For every 10 ships built, 3 would never return. The waves devoured them without memory. Some cracked in storms, some burned, some were torn open by torpedoes that struck like thunder. But their sacrifice was the arithmetic of victory, each sinking buying time, each voyage keeping the arteries of war alive. The men who sailed them called themselves sitting ducks. Yet they sailed again, and again, through fire and ice and silence. In every American city, the war became personal. Factory whistles replaced church bells. Cafeterias became canteens of urgency. Newspapers printed not headlines but tonnage counts: how many ships launched, how many lost, how many still fighting the Atlantic. The word liberty was no longer a slogan. It was the sound of cranes creaking at dawn, of trains shrieking through the night, sparks raining down like stars over the shipyards. By spring 1943, something had shifted. The convoys grew thicker. The gaps closed. For every ship the enemy sank, 2 more took its place. Radar eyes searched the sea. Aircraft circled above. The wolf packs, once invincible, found themselves lost in an ocean that suddenly belonged to someone else. A U-boat captain wrote in his log, "The convoys are endless. The sea itself seems to be producing them." Perhaps it was true. Perhaps the sea had turned against the hunters. As dawn broke over Richmond, the horizon shimmered with silhouettes, gray hulls lined side by side, ready to launch. The air was thick with diesel and salt. Somewhere a radio played swing music drowned by hammering steel. A welder looked up, wiping soot from her face, and saw hundreds of ships stretching toward the mist. "They'll never sink us all," she whispered. The stage was set, the players ordinary, their tools divine. The battle for the Atlantic had entered its second act. The ocean still waited cold and endless, but this time it was not empty. It was filled with ghosts of iron born from fire and fear, each carrying the weight of freedom across a sea that refused to yield. They said it couldn't be done, that no nation on earth could build ships faster than submarines could sink them. But America, in those years of smoke and sirens, no longer believed in the word impossible. The Atlantic had become a wound that bled steel, and the only cure was more steel. By 1943, the Liberty Ship program was no longer just an experiment. It was an industrial crusade. The assembly lines no longer made cars or stoves or tractors, they made hope. Hope measured in tons, forged in fire, and carried across an ocean that refused mercy. The shipyards roared day and night, a symphony of iron. The air smelled of salt oil and sweat. Sparks fell like stars onto blackened decks. Every clang of a hammer echoed like a heartbeat across a nation learning to build not for comfort, but for survival. In Richmond, California, 90,000 men and women labored under floodlights so bright they turned night into day. They came from farms, factories, kitchens, from every corner of America's tired, restless soul. They built ships the way miners dig for air because they had to. There was no other choice. Each Liberty ship was 441 feet long, 7,000 tons of raw endurance, 9,000 horsepower, pushing through storms, fire, and fear. Their skeletons were not carved by master shipwrights. They were welded by hands that had never touched the sea. Girls barely 20 wielding torches that hissed brighter than the sun. Men too old for the front hammering rivets until their arms gave out. In their faces was not pride, not yet only determination. The kind of quiet defiance that builds history and never asks for applause. Henry J. Kaiser's system turned chaos into precision. America became a single vast organism, railways pumping steel like blood through arteries of war. Plates from Pittsburgh, propellers from Detroit, boilers from Ohio, all converging on shipyards reborn overnight. Prefabrication became the new miracle, 250,000 pieces cut, stamped, and shipped to the coast like parts of a mechanical nation. What once took 9 months could now be done in 42 days. Some yards did it in 20. And once, just once, Richmond broke its own record, a Liberty ship built from keel to ocean in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. Workers cheered as she slid into the bay, smoke still rising from her welds. They named her Robert E. Peary, but to the men and women who built her, she was something else entirely, proof that time could be beaten. The Germans couldn't understand it. Admiral Dönitz had believed that tonnage was destiny, that if his U-boats sank more ships than the Allies could build, Britain would starve and surrender. For a while, the numbers agreed. In 1942, 8 million tons of Allied shipping were lost. But by the next year, something had shifted. For every Liberty ship that went down, 2 more were already leaving the dock. By late 1943, 1 new ship entered service every 8.3 hours. The wolf packs began to lose their teeth, not from lack of courage, but from lack of prey. A U-boat officer later wrote, "We destroy a convoy, and another takes its place the next morning. It is as though the sea itself manufactures them." He wasn't entirely wrong. The sea was producing them through the hands of the American worker. The Liberty program became a living organism, welders, machinists, railroad men, miners, all parts of a colossal pulse. The U.S. Maritime Commission tracked every inch of progress, how many tons of steel per hour, how many welds per ship, How many ships per month? It wasn't just production, it was arithmetic warfare. Every number mattered. Every decimal carried a name. Every completed hull meant more lives saved in the gray expanse of the Atlantic. Yet for all its efficiency, the program was imperfect. Welding still new to shipbuilding carried its own dangers. The cold seas of the Arctic and North Atlantic were merciless, brittle fractures, split hulls without warning. The John P. Gaines broke in two off Alaska. The Schenectady cracked clean across her deck. Men watched helplessly as steel once glowing with life folded back into the sea. But each disaster taught another lesson. Metallurgists studied the fractures, added new alloys, reinforced the joints. The ships improved not through design but through endurance, each failure becoming a blueprint for resilience. The cost was staggering $2 million for every Liberty ship, sometimes more. But the arithmetic favored the builders. Even if a ship sank on its first voyage, her cargo tanks, munitions, grain, or fuel often outweighed her own worth. It was a cruel economy, but a necessary one. The war was not about perfection. It was about volume, about outbuilding death itself. If we can't stop them from sinking, one official said, then we will drown them in our production. And so the yards worked on. Steel mills in Pittsburgh glowed red against the night sky, rivers turned to mirrors of fire. Trains screamed across the continent, wheels sparking cargo, thundering toward the sea. In New Orleans, black shipfitters sang to the rhythm of the hammer, their chants rising with each stroke. In Maine, women stood in line for torches, their faces blackened with soot. A nation's heartbeat measured in welds per minute. The Liberty ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a symbol, an industrial psalm sung by millions who would never hear the ocean's voice. By 1943, 611 Liberty ships had entered service. The convoys that once traveled thin and trembling now filled the horizon, hull after hull, gray and endless. U-boats no longer stalked prey. They faced an ocean made of steel. Each new launch was a small defiance, a whisper that the world would not drown. They call us slow, one sailor wrote, but we always get there. And they did, slowly, stubbornly, relentlessly, carrying bombs, blood, and belief across 3,000 miles of cold Atlantic. Still, there was no romance in their story. No gleam of battleships, no glory of aces. The Liberty fleet was invisible, built to be forgotten. Their decks were plain, their cabins narrow, their names barely painted before they vanished into fog. But anonymity was their armor. No single Liberty ship won the war. Yet together they made victory possible. They filled the ocean so completely that defeat no longer had room to breathe. In the war's mathematics of survival, they were the constant, unchanging, unyielding, unheroic. Steel against salt, sweat against fear, men and women against time. And in that equation, the answer was simple. The fleet that wasn't built to last had already outlived every expectation. The war still raged, but the Atlantic was no longer a graveyard. It was becoming a highway built by hands that refused to stop and ships that refused to die. Night in the shipyards never truly ended. It only shifted colors. The floodlights glared like artificial suns, burning through fog, smoke, and exhaustion. The clang of hammers echoed through the canyons of steel, rhythmic, eternal, 1,000 heartbeats beating in time. Sparks flew like fireflies, drifting down onto faces blackened by oil and grit. The smell was thick, hot iron sweat, salt coffee gone cold hours ago. They called it Kaiser's miracle. But to the people who lived it, it wasn't a miracle. It was survival with a blowtorch. In Richmond, California, a woman named Ruth Carver tightened her gloves and lowered her welding mask. She was 23, small, with arms that ached from 12-hour shifts and nights spent rocking a child to sleep. She wasn't a soldier, she didn't wear a uniform, but she was fighting a war all the same. "Every seam I weld," she whispered once to her friend, "is one less coffin in the Atlantic." Her torch hissed to life sparks reflecting in her eyes. The steel beneath her trembled like a living thing. In that moment she felt the heartbeat of something greater than herself. All around her, the shipyard breathed alive, monstrous, unstoppable. Men shouted over the din of cranes. Cranes groaned as their hooks swung tons of metal through the fog. Somewhere a whistle shrieked a warning, or maybe just the end of another endless shift. Trains rumbled nearby, carrying engines and propellers still hot from the furnace. The air was thick enough to taste salt and iron smoke and rain. The Pacific was just beyond the gates, but few ever saw it. They built ships for the ocean without ever touching its waves. In the canteen during the brief hours of rest, the workers sat shoulder to shoulder, strangers bound by fatigue. Tin cups clinked, laughter rose and died like sparks. How many ships, now someone would ask. 17 this month, came the reply, a mix of pride and disbelief. They didn't talk about war much, it was too big, too distant. They talked about families, about ration cards, about the radio static that carried Roosevelt's voice into their kitchens. And then they went back to work. Because if they stopped, someone out there would die. Far across the country in Baltimore, the night was the same. Floodlights cut through sleet, and the Chesapeake steamed with heat from the dry docks. Here the Liberty Fleet had its own rhythm, a slower, heavier one. Among the crews were black laborers from the South, migrants who had traded cotton fields for the clang of the shipyard. They came north by train carrying little more than calloused hands and hunger for fair pay. They were welders, burners, riggers. They worked side by side with men who'd never spoken to them before. The war blurred boundaries that the country itself had drawn in iron. In the yard, one man said, "You were either fast or fired." The steel didn't care what color you were. They worked in crews of 12, sleeping in shifts, eating from paper bags while waiting for cranes to lower the next section. Sometimes they sang old field songs, gospel hymns twisted into the rhythm of the hammer. The melodies rose over the roar of the furnaces, soft but steady. "This here's freedom," one of them said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Every plate I weld, that's another blow against the man who said we can't." And when the war ended, many would find those same words carved into the heart of a movement yet to come. In Portland, Oregon, snow fell in clumps that hissed as they met the hot steel. A foreman named Harold Quinn walked the line with a clipboard counting weld seams by lamplight. He hadn't seen his son in 2 years. The boy was somewhere in the Atlantic, a radio operator aboard a Liberty ship named Stephen Hopkins. Harold had built the ship himself, had watched it slide into the Columbia River, with his own hands still black from grease. Then one day the telegram came. The Stephen Hopkins had been lost at sea. A torpedo. No survivors. He kept working anyway. He didn't speak of it. But every night he paused by the next hull, placed his hand on the cold steel, and whispered, "Float, you bastard. Just float." That was the kind of faith that built the Invisible Fleet, not belief in victory, but belief in endurance. The Liberty ship was no masterpiece. She was a vessel of necessity held together by labor and prayer. And yet she carried something sacred, the fingerprints of millions. Housewives who assembled valves in Kansas. Students who packed bearings in Illinois. Lumbermen who cut timber for masts in Oregon. From the smallest bolt to the largest engine, each part bore a story, a face, a heartbeat. The ships themselves became collective monuments, floating memorials to ordinary lives transformed by war. When a new hull launched, the shipyards celebrated. Trumpets played flags, fluttered photographers, snapped grainy black and white frames. But the real ceremony was quieter. The workers watched the water take the weight of their creation. They watched the hull settle, the waves lap against it. And for a moment, just a moment, everything stopped. A silence deep as prayer. Then the cheering began. "Another one for the boys out there," someone shouted. Champagne smashed against steel, and the ship slid forward, slow, majestic, inevitable. A child cried. A siren wailed. The water closed behind her like history sealing another secret. But beyond the shipyards, the human story continued at sea. On the decks of Liberty ships, sailors faced a different kind of war, one fought in darkness and silence. The ships moved in convoys, long lines of gray ghosts swam, cutting through fog. The cold was absolute salt, froze on beards, waves smashed over rails like fists. Every sound mattered. The hum of engines, the whistle of wind, the click of a distant sonar ping. Somewhere below, invisible, a U-boat listened, waiting, watching. One hit could end it all, no warning, no chance. But still the ships kept moving, slowly, steadily, relentlessly. On one such night in 1943, the SS James Otis crept through the black Atlantic under blackout order. The crew was exhausted, frost on their jackets, diesel in their lungs. In the radio cabin, a 19-year-old operator named Frank Doyle wrote a letter he would never send. "The sea is quiet tonight," he wrote, "too quiet. Every wave feels like it's listening. But when I think of home, I remember the noise, the sound of those hammers in the yards. If they can keep going, so can we." Minutes later, a torpedo struck the ship's bow. Frank didn't finish his letter. But the next day, when survivors were pulled from the wreckage, they found it sealed in his pocket, dry, unburned. Back on land, the shipyards never stopped. They couldn't afford to. For every loss reported, another hull took shape. The workers didn't hear about individual ships, only numbers. 2710 built, 200 sunk, 600 damaged. It was arithmetic made of flesh and steel. But once in a while a letter arrived, a sailor writing from Gibraltar or Iceland or Murmansk, thanking the anonymous souls who had welded his ship together. "You saved me," they wrote. "You don't know my name, but I owe you everything." Those letters were read aloud in the yards, passed from hand to hand until the words blurred with oil. For a moment the faces lifted, the eyes brightened. Then someone would say, "All right, back to work," and the thunder of hammers resumed. In those years, the Liberty Fleet was not just a weapon, it was a bond between people who would never meet. The welders and sailors, the machinists and navigators, each dependent on the other, each invisible to the other. Their connection ran deeper than patriotism. It was something simpler and stronger. It was duty. A kind of faith that doesn't need words. Faith that if you build it right, if you keep believing, the ocean will hold. And so they built. And they sailed. And they endured. The war was not won in the sky or on the beaches, but here in the flicker of a torch, in the hum of an engine, in the trembling hands of those who refused to stop. For in every Liberty ship that crossed the Atlantic, there was a piece of someone left behind, a fingerprint in the weld, a whisper in the steel, a heartbeat in the hull. And together, those heartbeats made the ocean theirs. By 1943, the Atlantic had changed. The cold, gray silence that once belonged to the wolves now throbbed with something else, the pulse of steel. Convoys that had once been scattered across the ocean in fear now moved like floating cities, long, endless, defiant. The men who had sailed through hell in 1942 said it felt different now. The sky no longer belonged to the enemy. The horizon was no longer empty. Where there had once been one ship, there were now 20. Where there had been dread, there was rhythm. The Liberty ships had multiplied beyond imagination. What began as a desperate experiment had become an industrial empire at sea. 10 vessels, each one numbered, catalogued, assembled, and launched as if conjured by sheer will. Together they formed what some officers called America's second coastline. From Halifax to Liverpool, from New York to Murmansk, the horizon was lined with gray silhouettes moving in slow procession, bound together by invisible threads of faith and logistics. The ocean had turned from a graveyard into a highway. The Germans still hunted. The U-boats prowled, but they were drowning in their own arithmetic. Admiral Dönitz once believed he could sink 700,000 tons a month and force Britain to her knees. But now, even as he struck, the losses were replaced before he could report them. In May 1943, Black May they called it, 41 U-boats were destroyed in 1 month. It was the breaking point. The wolf packs that once roamed with impunity were now being hunted themselves. For every torpedo fired, a depth charge answered. For every periscope that rose above the waves, a destroyer was waiting. Germany had built 1,162 submarines. By war's end, America had built more than double that number in Liberty ships alone. The sea itself had turned against the hunters, and yet, the victory wasn't in battles. It was in logistics, in math, in the monotonous miracle of production. The Liberty ships didn't fight, they endured. They replaced loss with persistence, grief with repetition. For every man who drowned, another sailed. For every vessel lost to fire and storm, another slipped down the rails into the waiting tide. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won by admirals. It was won by planners, accountants, welders, and factory girls with calloused hands and tired eyes. It was won by the invisible. Reports from the Office of Naval Intelligence read like scripture, cold, absolute. Average ship output, 3 per day. Convoy tonnage doubled in 6 months. Merchant survival rate improved 37%. In Washington, the War Production Board drew lines on maps, one for every convoy, every loss, every new hull. Each week, the lines grew thicker, denser, alive. The statistics told the story. No headline could. The Liberty Fleet had become the backbone of a new kind of warfare, industrial, relentless, faceless. But the cost was immense. The Atlantic claimed 3,500 merchant ships during the war. Of those, hundreds were Liberty ships. Some burned in sight of the convoy. Some froze in Arctic blackness, the ice sealing the hatches before anyone could escape. Others simply vanished. No distress call, no wreckage, no survivors. Just coordinates marked with silence. The men who sailed them called it the invisible graveyard. They knew their odds, 1 in 5. Yet they kept going. They joked darkly, "We're the ghosts of tomorrow." And still they loaded the cargo, checked the engines, lit their cigarettes in the wind, and set out again. There were stories, fragments of what it felt like inside those convoys. Endless nights when the sky burned orange with oil fires. When the sea itself seemed alive with light green phosphorus glowing over wrecks below. When men prayed without words, staring at the black horizon, waiting for the sound. They all feared the low, hollow thud of a torpedo. Yet for every ship that went down, 10 more pushed through. The Liberty ships didn't fight the enemy, they buried him under cargo. In Liverpool, dockhands began calling them the ghosts with cargo. They'd appear through fog-battered listing paint, scorched off by explosions, decks black with soot, and yet still afloat. Some arrived with holes large enough to drive trucks through their hulls, stitched together by makeshift welding done mid-ocean. Others limped into port, trailing smoke, their flags shredded, but still flying. One ship, the SS John W. Brown, survived 2 torpedo attacks, fires, and an air raid, and still delivered her cargo of tanks to North Africa. Another, the Stephen Hopkins, outgunned by a German raider, returned fire with a single cannon until she sank. The sea swallowed her whole, but her defiance lived on in every yard that built another. The Liberty Fleet became myth long before the war ended. Sailors began to say they could feel the ships breathing, that the engines had a rhythm, a pulse that matched their own. Superstition spread in the fog. If you spoke to the steel, it would listen. Men carved initials into bulkheads, whispered prayers to the rivets, tied small talismans to the rails, tokens of luck against the cold mathematics of the sea. She'll hold, they said. She always does, and most of the time, she did. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Germany had precision U-boats built like watches, battleships polished like instruments. America had scale, crude, vast, overwhelming. The Liberty ships were the embodiment of that scale. They were ugly, slow, sometimes flawed, but they were enough. And enough was all the war required. They called it the tyranny of numbers. For every 100 men Germany could field, America could build 100 ships to feed them, 100 planes to bomb them, 100 engines to outlast them. The Liberty Fleet became the living proof that quantity, when driven by purpose, becomes quality. And yet beneath the numbers there was something poetic, something mythic. Those who lived through it said the sea itself changed tone. The Atlantic, once haunted by death, began to hum with movement. The convoys moved like living creatures, gray backs rolling over swells, each hull carrying a heartbeat from the factories back home. The ocean that had swallowed so many now carried them forward, heavy, scarred, but alive. It was as if the ghosts of the drowned had returned in steel form, refusing to vanish again. By late 1944, the balance was no longer in question. Liberty ships had delivered more than 40 million tons of cargo. They had carried 200,000 soldiers across oceans. They had hauled the tanks of Patton, the fuel of Montgomery, the rations of the Red Army. They had done it without fanfare, without the roar of engines or the flash of guns. Quietly, invisibly, they had won the world's most crucial war, the war of movement, the war of endurance, the war of supply. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted what the generals could not. "We lost," he wrote, "not because we lacked courage, but because we were outbuilt." The line was simple, final, devastating. Germany had fought with precision, America had fought with factories. And in the end, the hum of a Liberty ship's engine was louder than the boom of any gun. When the war finally tilted westward, when the beaches of Normandy filled with men and machines, it was Liberty ships that carried them there. They arrived at dawn, gray on gray, unloading jeeps, rifles, and dreams onto blood-soaked sand. Behind every soldier charging ashore, there was a welder, a riveter, a machinist who had built the invisible bridge across the sea. They didn't see the battle, but the battle couldn't have existed without them. As 1945 approached, the Atlantic grew quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of completion. The Liberty ships, once born from panic, now floated as symbols of perseverance. Many would be scrapped, sold, forgotten. Others would carry cargo into peace engines still humming with the memory of war. And somewhere in that endless ocean beneath storms and foam lay the others, the ones that never came home. Their steel rusted, their names erased by salt and time. But even there they kept their vigil. For they were not just ships, they were the proof that a nation's strength isn't in the speed of its weapons, but in the hands that build what endures. The war was ending, but the ocean still breathed heavy. The Atlantic, that gray, endless stage of ghosts and thunder, had grown quieter now. The guns had faded. The smoke had lifted. Yet in the silence the ships still moved. Slow, relentless. carrying the last cargoes of a dying empire and the first seeds of a new one. The Liberty fleet, once built to last 5 years, maybe less, was still alive. Their hulls scarred by ice and flame, their decks dented, their paint stripped by wind. And yet they floated. The fleet that was never meant to endure had outlasted the war itself. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the world's harbors filled with gray silhouettes. Liberty ships anchored side by side, their bows pointing toward horizons they no longer needed to cross. London, Le Havre. Naples, Casablanca. Every port brimmed with the steel faces of victory. Sailors leaned over railings, staring at cities half in ruins, half reborn. The air smelled of diesel and salt and something new, peace. Fragile, foreign, uncertain peace. The ocean was no longer a battlefield. But it wasn't home either. It was simply the space between what had been and what would come next. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, wrote later from his prison cell, "We were fighting an industrial nation, not an army." He had finally understood what his submarines never could. That this war had not been won by soldiers alone, but by factories, by sweat, by assembly lines that never slept. The Liberty ship was not a marvel of technology, it was a triumph of will. It was the sound of America's heart, translated into iron. It was proof that the nation could build faster than fear could destroy. In the yards, the lights began to dim. Welders hung up their masks. The cranes fell still. The same men and women who had built the world's largest fleet watched it sail toward history. Some wept, some cheered. Most just stood silent, staring at the empty slips. They had given everything, years, families, strength, to the rhythm of hammer and torch. And now, the rhythm was gone. The war that had defined their purpose had ended. The sound of silence was almost unbearable. In one shipyard in Savannah, an old worker named Samuel Reeves carved his initials into a wooden beam before the demolition crews came. He had worked through 200 launches, never missing a day, even when fever took him to the edge. "They'll tear this place down soon," he said softly. "But the ships, they'll keep sailing. That's enough." And he was right. For though the yards fell quiet, the Liberty fleet sailed on into a world that still needed them. When Europe starved in the winter of 1946, it was Liberty ships that carried grain and milk to children who had never tasted peace. When the UN formed its first relief convoys, the ships that answered were not new. They were gray, rusted, still bearing the scars of torpedoes. They had carried tanks once now. They carried bread. And somewhere deep inside their hulls, beneath the layers of paint and time, there was something unbroken, the hum of endurance, the sound of duty that never ends. Some were sold to private companies, refitted, renamed, forgotten. Others were left to rot in anchorages, floating cemeteries of history. By the 1950s, hundreds lay in reserve fleets, their decks covered in gulls, their engines silent, their ghosts intact. But when the Korean War began, they returned. The same ships that had fought the Atlantic now carried supplies to Pusan and Incheon. Once more the old steel stirred. Once more the fleet that refused to die answered the call. Those who sailed them said they could still hear the old war in the creak of the decks. That when the engines roared to life, the ghosts of welders and sailors stirred somewhere deep inside the hulls. "It's like they remember," one captain said. "Every wave we cross, they remember who built them." The Liberty ships had become more than vessels. They were monuments not of triumph, but of persistence. They embodied something the war had revealed, and the peace would soon forget, that the greatest victories are not won in battlefields, but in factories, in sweat, in silence. Yet time is cruel even to legends. By the 1960s, the Liberty fleet was fading. The oceans grew faster, the cargo heavier, the engines smaller and stronger. The world moved on, and the ships that once saved it were scrapped by the hundreds. Steel melted names, erased histories folded into junkyards. But even as the torches tore through their hulls, pieces of them lived on their steel, reused in bridges, buildings, new ships. The ghosts of the Liberty Fleet were reincarnated into the modern world they had helped create. A few escaped the torch. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, the John W. Brown. Preserved by the hands of veterans and dreamers, their decks still echo with footsteps. Their bridges still smell of salt and rust. When the O'Brien steamed from San Francisco to Normandy in 1994, 50 years after D-Day, her engines sounded exactly as they had in 1944. The same heartbeat, the same rhythm of a world that once believed anything was possible if enough hands built together. The old ship cut through calm seas, smoke trailing behind her like memory itself. On her deck, sailors from 2 wars stood silent, hats in hand, listening. The sound of those engines, the deep, patient pulse, was the sound of history refusing to fade. For those who remember, the Liberty ship is not just steel and rivets. It is the story of a generation that built faster than destruction. A people who turned fear into endurance, despair into machinery, and hope into cargo. They were not glamorous. They were not beautiful. They were not even safe. But they worked, and they endured. And through endurance, they became immortal. Today, when you walk the decks of a surviving Liberty ship, the air feels different. It hums. The walls breathe. The pipes rattle softly as though whispering to the ghosts of those who never returned. The paint may be new, but beneath it lies history burned into every seam. You can almost hear them, the welders, the machinists, the sailors who once slept in bunks barely big enough to turn in. Their laughter still echoes faintly in the steel. Their footsteps never left. The payoff of their labor wasn't just victory. It was proof. Proof that a nation's might is not measured in how many guns it wields, but in how many hands it puts to work for something greater. The Liberty ships were not the fastest, not the strongest, not the most beautiful, but they were enough. And that was what won the Atlantic. That was what changed the war and the world. As the last of them fade into rust and memory, they leave behind more than steel. They leave behind a question whispered across waves, echoing in dockyards, long silent. What does it mean to build something not for glory, but for necessity? What does it mean to create something meant to die and have it outlive everything else? In that question lies the legacy of the Liberty ship. A fleet born of fear, forged in urgency, forgotten by history, and yet still afloat in the memory of every sea it ever crossed. Their engines may be quiet now, but if you listen closely through the wind, through the rust, through the hum of the earth itself, you can still hear them. The heartbeat of an invisible fleet. The sound of the ocean remembering what men built when hope seemed lost. The echo of steel that refused to sink. The sea has no memory. That's what sailors used to say. That the waves erase everything, names, ships, wars, even the dead. But they were wrong. The sea remembers. It remembers the gray silhouettes that crossed it when the world was on fire. It remembers the hum of engines built by hands that never touched salt water. It remembers the steel prayers of a nation that refused to drown. The Liberty Fleet, 710 vessels born in panic, forged in unity, still drifts somewhere between history and myth. The ocean carries their ghosts like whispers, not haunting, just watching. When the last Liberty ship was launched, there was no speech, no anthem, no parade. Only wind and water, and the sound of chains uncoiling, as the hull slid into the tide. The world was already moving on to new wars, new industries, new fears. But the ships stayed behind, patient and silent, their stories anchored beneath the noise of progress. And yet, they never truly left. The world they helped build sails upon their bones. If you stand today on the deck of one that remains, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco, or the John W. Brown in Baltimore, and you close your eyes, you can still hear it. That low rhythmic vibration in the steel, like a heartbeat buried deep within. It isn't an engine anymore, it's memory. It's the echo of hammers in the shipyards, the hiss of torches, the shouted names across fog and flame. It's the laughter of women welding under floodlights, the songs of black workers in the yards of Baltimore, the prayers whispered in bunk rooms before convoys slipped into darkness. The ships breathe those sounds still. They have become their own kind of monument, not of marble or brass, but of motion, of endurance, of return. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic, thousands of them sleep. Their names rusted away, their cargo still sealed in the dark. They lie at every depth off Iceland, Newfoundland, the Bay of Biscay, silent cathedrals of steel. No tourists visit them. No flags wave above them. But divers say that when the currents shift and the light cuts through the green, you can still see the outlines of the letters Liberty. The sea never forgets those who crossed it in defiance. The ocean, in its endless movement, keeps time for them. Every wave is a remembrance. Every storm is a requiem. History calls them temporary. Ships meant to last 5 years, maybe less. And yet decades later, fragments of them still live on. Some became barges, ferries, training vessels. Others were dismantled, their steel reborn into bridges and skyscrapers. The iron that once crossed the Atlantic now holds up cities, carries trains, shapes the very bones of America. What began as emergency steel became the skeleton of the modern world. In every bridge beam that hums with traffic, in every rail that gleams beneath a locomotive's weight, there is the ghost of a Liberty ship. But maybe their truest legacy is not what they built, it's what they proved. That greatness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums in rhythm. Sometimes it's slow, awkward, imperfect, but relentless. The Liberty ships were never beautiful, not in the way battleships gleamed or aircraft carriers towered. They were plain, industrial, ordinary. Yet they carried the extraordinary. They were vessels of belief that ordinary people could move mountains if given steel, fire, and purpose. That faith in work could outlast fear of war. That in unity there is victory, not the kind carved into monuments, but the kind that sails quietly into the horizon and endures. The old sailors used to say you could always tell a Liberty ship by her sound, the deep, slow rhythm of her engines, as though she were breathing with the sea. The same sound followed them across oceans, through storms, through fire. When they finally came home, it was still there, a reminder that something built in desperation had become a symbol of patience. That a machine built to die young had instead learned how to live. And yet even now few remember their names. Their captains are forgotten, their crews unrecorded, their voyages untold. History prefers its heroes glamorous, its victories clean. The Liberty ships were neither. They were messy, noisy, exhausting. They leaked, they burned, they broke. But they arrived. That was their perfection, not in form, but in completion. And in a world obsessed with speed and spectacle, perhaps that's the rarest kind of heroism. If you listen, really listen to the harbor wind at night, you might still hear it. A faint hum beneath the waves, the sound of an invisible fleet still sailing, still moving through time. It's not imagination. It's memory disguised as tide. It's history refusing to fade. Because the Liberty Fleet was never just a collection of ships, it was a heartbeat. It was 2,710 pulses of belief hammered into existence, proof that a nation's strength lies not in its weapons, but in its workers. When dawn breaks over the sea, the light catches the surface and turns it silver like the hulls once did. For a brief moment, if you look closely, you can almost see them. Lines of gray shapes fading into mist smoke, curling waves breaking gently against their sides. Then they're gone, swallowed by distance like a memory closing its eyes. But the feeling remains. The quiet pride. The echo of engines that will never stop completely. And maybe that's how it should be, so. The Liberty ships were never built to be monuments. They were built to serve, to carry, to endure. Their legacy isn't in marble statues or golden plaques. It's in the persistence of those who refuse to stop building, even when the world seems to fall apart. It's in every unseen hand that keeps turning bolts, keeps welding beams, keeps faith with the idea that work, honest, relentless work, can save more lives than war ever could. As the voice fades, imagine one last image. A Liberty ship, rusted but proud, cutting through calm water. Her bow slices the waves, her wake spreads wide, and behind her the sun rises orange, then gold, then white. The sea glitters, the air hums. You can't hear the engines anymore, but you can feel them. The vibration beneath your feet, steady, ancient, eternal. It's not noise, it's the memory of movement. The sound of a people who once built faster than fear, who forged freedom in the furnace of necessity, and who left behind not a fleet, but a feeling. Some stories end in silence, others keep moving. The Liberty Fleet, the invisible armada that crossed the Atlantic and changed the world, never truly stopped sailing. It simply dissolved into the horizon. And if you stand long enough at the water's edge and listen as the wind moves across the tide, you'll hear it faint, distant, unbroken, the sound of liberty, still echoing across the sea.